In the previous episode of the series, which is linked below, we briefly looked at the diversification of body plans following the emergence of multicellular systems to focus on the origin of our own phylum, Chordata, and its subsequent diversification into a dozen or so clades of vertebrates that we would all commonly recognize in unofficial layman's language as fish, of which only two clades survive, one of them being jawed fish, Gnathostomata, of which, again, only two daughter clades survive. Chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, and Osteichthyes, also known as bony fish, because they start with essentially the same skeleton but simply add more calcium to it to make it into bone. This group, too, diversified into another couple of daughter sets, Actironopterygii, which are the ray-finned fish familiar to all fishermen, and Sarcopterygii, which are the rare and strange lobe-finned fish, meaning that their fins are on the ends of appendages like little arms. I mentioned there that I would probably do a video on the evolution of sharks and another one on the evolution of ray-finned fish, because there are some interesting fossils in both of those groups that I don't think most of people have ever heard of. And while I should probably start with sharks because they came first, I really want to prioritize our own lineage. So today we're talking about what we colloquially refer to as lobe-finned fish, Sarcopterygii, also known as Crossopterygii. These fish are not like either of the other two types of fish that everyone has seen and probably touched. There are very few species of lobe-finned fish left alive, but the fossil record shows that the world used to be full of them. Wikipedia's cladograms are usually fine illustrations for this type of introduction to phylogeny, but I usually have to check and correct them, or at least fill in where there are important ones not shown in the main charts. In this case, I had to suture a few different cladograms together because none of them show the whole picture correctly. For example, Sarcopterygii is missing their earliest and most primitive order, as well as all the other stem genera leading into the main. Remember that the earliest forms of any clade will be the most generalized and the most similar to their sister clades. Basal forms like Goyu look like a transitional form between Sarcopterygians and ray-finned fish, because their fins are barely lobed at this early stage, and some of the stem groups share similarities with basal sharks as well. Just as sharks produce new teeth on a jaw that whorls, such that new teeth replace old ones on a rolling conveyor, Saurolepis also had a pair of tooth whorls that worked the same way. And this leads into onychodontiforms, represented here by the 4-inch-long Strunius, the equally tiny Kingmetidus, the meter-long Grossius, and the much larger Onychodus, which could be 6 to 10 feet long. I made one of these once out of styrofoam and construction paper, and I mounted it on my wall like a fishing trophy. Actually, what I made was a composite of two different forms because onychodons have a different type of tail. I should make another one of these and do it properly this time because they are interesting looking fish. Wikipedia shows Bucinotis just barely within the clade of onychodontiforms, but it's actually just outside of that, as should be indicated by its more generalized type of teeth. They're not on a whorl. And as you can tell by the shape of the body, Bucinotis are more closely related to coelacanths. And I have to talk about this. Religious fundamentalists and other pseudoscience reality deniers like to pretend as if extinct species are all still out there somewhere, as if there are still megalodons prowling unnoticed in the depths, as if there's an elasmosaur in Loch Ness and a sauropod dinosaur hiding in the swamps of the Congo and a pterosaur flying low over the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. I'm sorry to say that I used to believe all that myself. When I was a little kid, I was all into cryptozoology, the search for lost species. Coelacanths were originally known only from fossils, with several examples ranging from the Devonian through the late Cretaceous, but none have ever been found from any point in the Cenozoic era. Because they are deep water fish, they had never been seen alive before we had deep net trawlers. So one was discovered by a paleontologist only after it had been hauled up and laid out dead in an Indonesian fish market. Defenders of the faith like to pretend as if scientists don't really know what they do. So believers crowed that the coelacanth still exists, unchanged after all this time, as if that meant that either evolution was wrong or fossil dating systems were wrong or both. But the fact is that it's not the coelacanth. Two species are now known to exist today, both in the genus Latimeria. Neither of them can be found in the fossil record, and they are distinctly different from any of the 9 other genera illustrated here that are known only from fossils. But this isn't all there is. Look, for example, at Mosonia. That's not a single species, nor even a genus. That's a taxonomic family, and all these genera are part of it. If you study zoology, you'll learn that there are many more species across the world than you could have guessed. But if you study paleontology, you'll discover that there were a whole lot more genera in the fossil record than are alive today. Like most clades, Sarcopterygii is divided into 2 main subsets. If we look into Actinista, the clade of coelacanths, you'll see that there are, or rather were, quite a lot of different species occurring in different periods over a span of more than 300 million years. But none of their fossils had ever been found from the last 66 million years, since the global mass extinction event that killed the dinosaurs. So it was a surprise that out of all of these extinct varieties, there is one genus that still exists. Remember also that evolution is the one and only explanation of biodiversity, scientific or otherwise. Thus, all of these varieties represent evolutionary divergence. So it is factually false to claim that the coelacanth remains unchanged as if it hadn't evolved over all this time, when they have clearly evolved quite a bit. A third clade of Sarcopterygii and a sister clade of coelacanths is Rhipidistia. One of the defining characteristics of this clade is that you may have seen how some fish can jut out their upper and lower jaws to seize prey. The Rhipidistian condition is that the upper jaw is no longer movable. It's fused to the skull. You may have noticed that your upper jaw is part of your skull. Now you know why that is. Like most clades, there are 2 main groups. There is the main lineage of tetrapodomorphs and another clade of what we call lungfish, as well as a stem group of porelepiforms, an order with a number of transitional or intermediate features between those other 2. One of them, of course, has to do with the development of lungs. You see, teleost or ray-finned fish commonly have a swim bladder. If you have a tropical fish tank, you may have noticed your fish going up to the surface to get a gulp of air. This is to fill that bladder, usually for the purpose of buoyancy. But some fish developed a distension in that, a side sac, or in some cases 2 side sacs, with another advantage. Because of the way these air sacs are already connected to the mouth and gills, they make another connection to provide greater oxygen content to the heart. This means that such fish can be bigger or more energetic, or they can still live in warm, stagnant water where there's little or no oxygen, or they can even get out of the water entirely and breathe through their lungs exclusively, which is what lungfish do. While some other types of fish may have a single asymmetrical lung, Rhipidistians are identified as having 2 lungs. In areas where all of the water dries up for some part of the year, lungfish burrow into the mud while it is still wet and encase themselves in mucus, where they wait for a few months for the rains to come. To my experience, if someone knows about lungfish at all, they usually think there's only 1 species. At most, they'll be aware of 2. In fact, there are a half-dozen species in 3 genera alive today. This again is where zoology reveals that there is more out there than you know. And paleontology reveals that there were a whole lot more then than now. If it doesn't look like that at first, look deeper. Another notable trait is that while lungfish diminished the strength of their limbs, tetrapodomorphs went the other way, working their limbs out. This clade can also be known as coenets, because where the nostrils of most fish are just holes that enter into the mouth even when the mouth is closed, our lineage has a nasal cavity connecting the nostrils to the throat, and this is illustrated even in the earliest of these tetrapodomorphs, or coenates, if you prefer. We'll take a quick look at some of the side branches, like rhizodonts. Now, these lived in lakes and rivers from the late Devonian into the Carboniferous period. They were the largest freshwater fish ever. If you like fishing and you went back in time to hook one of these, then it has caught you.
You're going to need a bigger boat.
One rhizodont of particular interest is Sauropterus. Paleontologist Neil Schumann studied the lobed fin of this fish and found therein all the bones that still exist in human arms and hands, and even shoulders. He wrote a book about it that became a bestseller. Of course, all the same bony configurations were found in the osteolipid clades of Canowindridae, Megalichthiiformes, and others. One of the most important images illustrating evolution is the transition from sea to land. It's the iconic image of what we think of as a fish walking out of the sea to become what we usually think of as amphibians, and then some antiquated notion of amphibians become reptiles, and then reptilian-looking things become mammals. And none of that is taxonomically correct, like at all, but that is the classic concept from the 19th century. We know several definite clarifications and corrections now, though the general image of that is still superficially, at least visibly correct, if not definitively. As we get into the relatively new forms, eotetrapodiforms, we come to different choices of vocation. Two strategies to consider is that you can either be versatile, capable of doing several different jobs, but none of them particularly well, or you can specialize, getting really good at one thing, which means you may be better at that than anyone else, but you're not able to do all of those other things too. Generally, being generalized is better from an evolutionary point of view because it means more options. If you get too specialized, then you paint yourself into a corner where it's hard to get back. We see this demonstrated in these two diverging groups, where one excelled at swimming while the other learned to walk. On the one side, we have Tristicopteridae. This group has a few small types, but there is also Eusthenopteron, once the most famous of all paleofish. These were commonly over 6 feet long and would make fine fishing trophy. Then there's Hyneria, which was twice as big enough to eat you. And once upon a time, a century or so ago, back before paleontologists had discovered any of the transitional forms from fin to feet, Eusthenopteron was the only eotetrapodomorph then known, and it was consequently depicted as if it had been the first one to begin the move on to land. As you'll see in a moment, we have since unearthed lots better contenders for that. It may have been possible for Tristicopterids to chase their prey right up onto the beach, but if so, then that's as far as they got. They weren't trying to do both land and sea. Instead, they excelled only at swimming, specifically as ambush predators using sudden rapid acceleration. Whereas the next group, Epistogalia, were never going to be Olympian swimmers. They couldn't instantly rocket forward like a barracuda, not unless they used their fingers to hold on and keep themselves still on the bottom, and then use those fingers again to launch from the brecon on the bottom so that they could accelerate that way. But they were better able to navigate shallow, cluttered creeks and even crawl out on the land now and again, which some fish have to do to get to the next pool or pond. Epistogalia has an advantage over other fish by having a pair of symmetrical lungs. And one important change here is that most fish have a dorsal fin on the top of their back and another different one further back. And then on the underside, they have paired pectoral fins and paired pelvic fins, as well as a singular anal fin, and then of course the caudal fin, which is their tail. But Epistogalia lost all of their single fins, keeping only the paired ones in addition to the tail, of course. The pectoral fins are connected to each other in a kind of shoulder assembly, and their pelvic fins are connected to each other too by a rudimentary pelvis. So what we have are four-legged fish that are starting to look like tetrapods. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals are all tetrapods, four-legged animals skeletally adapted for life on dry land. But here we see a sequence of transitional intermediates, or fish tetrapods, sometimes referred to by scientists as fishapods. Included in this group is Tiktaalik, the first fish known to have had a neck between its skull and pectoral girdle, which fish normally don't have. It has also lost the bony gill cover that is common among bony fish. If it still had a gill cover, then it would have been flesh only. Which gets us to the next daughter group, Stegocephalia. Lacking bony gill covers, though they still have internal gill bars, and having what was at first a rib fused to an improved pelvis connecting it to the spine, so that now the hind limbs are just as strong as the forelimbs. The earliest member of this group is Elginurbaton. Years ago, when I was into paleo art, I sculpted this rendering out of clay. Fortunately, I took this picture of it before trying to fire it, because even after weeks of drying, there was still enough moisture inside of it that it exploded the kiln. One other diagnostic feature of stegocephalians is that they have rudimentary fingers, emerging through their fin rays, because it turns out that the same cells that grow fin rays can also grow fingers. And this becomes more obvious by the time we get to Acanthostega. And this is my favorite transitional species ever. Better than Lucy, better than Archie. because it is a real-life representation of the Darwin fish. This was a 2-foot-long, 4-footed fish, still with internal gill bars and fin raised like a fish, but it is also a tetrapod, showing development of elbow and wrist or knee and ankle joints, and even the ear bones of a tetrapod. But it didn't quite yet have the sufficient skeletal support to crawl out at least comfortably on land. So we move to the next most important taxa in our sequence, Ichthyostega. It was essentially the same thing, just better adapted for crawling out of the water to what was at that time the relative safety of being on land. Ichthyostega didn't have internal gills anymore, though it may have retained the now unconnected gill fronds such as modern salamander larvae still have. But it also had rays in its tail fluke, where no amphibian has those anymore. So that is a vestigial fish trait. Interestingly, Acanthostega had 8 toes on each foot, and Ichthyostega had 7 toes, with 3 of them clustered together such that they look like a thumb or a big toe. Tulerpaton was another slightly more adapted form, and it had 6 toes. And then we get into the more amphibious-looking tetrapods that only have 5 toes, and thus pentadactyly became the standard forever after. Some animals might lose toes so that they have only 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, but it is very rare that anything ever has 6. 5 fingers is the norm, and that's why most people's hands look like this. Wikipedia shows Bucanote. Shut the fuck up. Wikipedia shows. Shut up. Wikipedia. Wikipedia. No, okay.